Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and my plan is to join the aristocracy by marrying the famous Lady Begood. She must have existed. They wrote a musical about her. Well, oddly enough, Gershwin is one of the names who's going to come up in today's conversation. And thank you so much for coming back to hear this week's episode, which is part 2 of the interview that I conducted with Cameron Smith, the respected musical theatre journalist who's contributed to the Musical Theatre Review magazine, an online website, and for many years ran his own blog online called Middlebrow Musicals, which I've always considered to be one of the best, most interesting, and certainly the most cogently argued series of essays on musical theatre that I've come across. And Cameron is no less interesting in person, as I hope last week's interview showed. Well, today we're hearing the second part of that, and we carry on from where we left off. We'd just been talking about Andrew Lloyd Webber and operetta, and from there we leap effortlessly into Richard Rodgers, Sandy Wilson, the Gershwins, Michael Feinstein, John Wilson, and Johnny Mercer and Andre Previn's wonderful musical The Good Companions. And to quote a lyric from that musical, all points north. Here's Cameron Smith. Musical Talk. Let's talk about Richard Rodgers then, as you were talking about his heavily influence on Andrew Lloyd Webber, because the man, the British composer who claims that he owes it all to Richard Rodgers is Sandy Wilson.
Oh, really? Okay.
And he's not writing operetta. He's not even writing sort of Broadway musicals. He's writing absolutely Britishy musicals, and I don't just mean The Boyfriend, which is a pastiche. I'm talking about all his works, from the Buccaneer.
But is he claiming now? This is the question with Roger. Which Richard Rodgers is he claiming to take that?
Early Rodgers, or as we know it, good Rodgers. People will know my antipathy towards Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Yeah, this would be another case of disagreement. I think
Oh dear.
need to put you into some sort of R&H re-education camp. I'll do the GNS one, you do the R&H one. But
as long as it's got an ampersand in the middle, we'll agree.
But no, I think. Well, I mean that's again the distinction, because I mean Rodgers with Hammerstein is that more European sound. I mean it's more romantic. It's more, he starts writing waltzes much more 3/4 time rather than 4/4 time.
It's much more sentimental.
And the American sound is very much 4/4 time.
So how did Rodgers and Hammerstein become the American sound? Because now that's what people think of as the Broadway tradition, in a way that, Rodgers and Hart, I agree with you, Rodgers and Hart is the New York tradition. Whereas, if you understand, I'm trying to sort of cynical and concise and sharp, whereas Rodgers and Hammerstein is overblown and sentimental and seems to be a Disney Broadway.
Well, it's Rodgers and Hart are urban, basically. They're like you say, they're New York, whereas Rodgers and Hammerstein sort of takes the musical rural. I mean, it opens it up. It opens it up into sort of folk America and that kind of thing.
Which doesn't speak to me at all, though. That's one of the problems. I'm a city boy, and I'm not at all interested in rednecks having a real good time as they eat their lobsters going plop in a pot, or whatever that ridiculous song is.
Well, a lot of people are very interested in that, but I think I don't know. With Rodgers and Hammerstein, I think it's just I do think that the combination of the words and music just seem to work very well. I mean, I think Rodgers was probably the best melodist. He was the best tunesmith of any of the Broadway composers, probably.
But why is he so different with Hammerstein? Why are there two Richard Rodgers then?
That's something I don't know. I mean, it's part of the Broadway tradition. I mean, you say that Rodgers and Hart is sort of more New Yorky, but the Broadway tradition has always come from these two different areas. It's always come from the vaudeville and from one end and from operetta from another end, and it's bringing those two together. And there are elements of vaudeville in Rodgers and Hammerstein. It's just they're not as apparent, and they're not as dominant, because they're dramas rather than comedies. But there's still plenty of comedy in them. And for that they do sort of go back slightly to the sort of musical comedy tradition rather than the sort of operetta tradition.
That's true, but there's a musical difference in Richard Rodgers' music, which I think is discernible. It's something to do with tempo and pace. I think the Hammerstein stuff is slower, but also I remember I'm sure I've heard various jazz players. That's such a generic term. Have said that you can always take a Rodgers and Hart number and swing it, and you cannot do that with most.
You can't.
You can. There's The Gentleman is a Dope is about the best song from the Hammerstein catalogue that works for that. But of course, it's the one that's most like a Rodgers and Hart song.
Yes, yeah. I think musically the difference is with Rodgers and Hart, the Rodgers of Rodgers and Hart. Part of it is
that's
the
Barrett's of Wimpole Street. You're writing your own musicals here.
It's part of it. A lot of it is the rhythm, and so it's basically syncopation. So it's playing on the offbeat and playing rather than playing on the beat. When he starts writing with Hammerstein, it's much more four-square. Square is the best term for it.
Square in every sense, actually.
As well as the difference between the 4/4 and the 3/4, and starts writing more waltzes with Hammerstein, which is from the European tradition rather than from the American. And I think that's to do with the language. It's something to do with the rhythm of the language. It lends itself to 4/4 in American, that sort of slangy, catchy sort of stuff. I think it's also something to do with the sort of blue notes and the slight in the melodies. So that comes from blues, where you sort of slightly flatten the third and the seventh of a scale, and that gives it that sort of slightly darkened tone or slightly different sound to some of the melodies, and then the harmonies are going to be more sort of jazzy, whereas once you get to Hammerstein, they're more sort of romantic. So in musical terms, I think that's the more romantic chords are using sort of more sixth chords and that sort of thing, which just sort of makes it sound a bit richer.
Okay.
That sort of thing.
So you think of Hammerstein, the Rodgers and Hammerstein, as richer?
More romantic, richer.
Oh, right, sort of lush rich.
Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah.
Because I think there's more going on in Rodgers and Hart. You say, for Rodgers and Hart, those songs I think are doing more. Partly because they're pacier and more cynical. So I find anything that's more cynical plays at more levels, whereas actually I don't think there are that many levels with a Hammerstein number. If they're rednecks telling you how much they like eating lobster, that's what they're doing, and there ain't much else going on.
No, but
used Aitner in homage to Oscar Hammerstein.
But it's a slightly different thing though, because Rodgers and Hart are essentially writing hit songs, whereas Rodgers and Hammerstein are essentially writing musical plays, which is slightly different. I think that
yes, no, that's fair.
What they're trying to do is a slightly different thing, so it's a bit hard to compare them in that way, I think.
And yet, some of the songs in Allegro, the famous failed Rodgers and Hammerstein, are the ones that's most like Rodgers and Hart. And you just wonder if that had done well, we'd have been spared, first of all, seeing Stephen Sondheim cry on stage in London, right, which I saw him do a couple of years ago as he...
Right, that was his favourite, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it was his first professional job in theatre as well. He was something like the rope handler for
curtains
or something exciting.
Okay.
But he said it was a modernistic piece and had some clever... It was borrowing from screen rather than stage traditions in having whites and, the continual business rather than curtains closing and opening and things like that. He actually burst into tears. Burst might be pushing it. He wept a little as he remembered it. And yet, it's in some ways most like the Heart. And you think, if that had gone well, would the world of Rodgers and Hammerstein come out in a totally different way? Or would I now be buying their albums rather than using them as posters?
I don't know. I think Hammerstein would probably. I think it's very genuine Hammerstein voice. So I think he probably would have gone on to write in the same sort of way. But the amazing thing about Richard Rodgers, though, is the fact that he does have these sort of two careers, and as you say, there isn't a huge amount of overlap. And he did seem to switch overnight, almost, as far as I can tell.
Like that, yeah.
But one minute he's written however many years he wrote with Hart, 20 odd years or something with Hart, one type of song, and then suddenly overnight with Oklahoma he suddenly switches and writes 20 odd years with.
And he also wrote sort of pseudo-classical music, or at least there's a famous documentary called Victory at Sea, which is a fantastic suite of music by Richard Rodgers, which I find very palatable, but obviously no lyrics. But
so it's really Hammerstein. Yeah, the problem with
well, actually, I think it is Hammerstein. I think after Showboat, I didn't need any more of that kind of thing. Showboat's fantastic, but don't keep rewriting it.
It's a very different. I mean, in the end, it's just to do with taste. I mean, I know Hammerstein. He's very much as far as I can tell, when people sort of write about him, they tend to write him more as a librettist because he's very influential as a librettist with Showboat and with Oklahoma, and how the musical developed on Broadway. And he's sometimes people are a bit sniffy about his lyrics, but I actually quite like his lyrics. I think his lyrics are pretty good. Again, there's lots of things wrong with them, and Sondheim's very good at picking them up. But I think in the end, he's one of the most thoughtful lyricists.
He's an evocative lyricist, I'd say. Younger Than Springtime Am I, although I don't like the way it's phrased, is a very effective song and gives me a sense of vitality somehow.
I think he is. I think he writes very singable lyrics, and it sounds very sort of basic thing to say, but I think actually it's sort of underrated quality of lyrics.
It's the Irving Berlin school, actually, in that sense. Singable, simplicity goes a long way if you can do it. If you can fake simplicity, you've mastered it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and probably one of the reasons why I like Berlin as well. Yeah. There is something about that just makes them very singable, which is even more remarkable considering he wrote the lyrics first. And so he actually had to write lyrics that were almost generically singable, not worrying about, it has to be singable on this particular note. They just had to be singable. And he obviously just had a knack for knowing what would sing.
The words to...
For the most part, Hammerstein wrote the words first.
I didn't know that, which is the Gilbert and Sullivan school, funny enough. Gilbert first, then Sullivan. What about Rodgers and Hart?
I think that was the other way around, you see, because...
there tells a story.
I think the story is that Lorenz Hart wasn't entirely reliable when it came to lyric writing. I think it was...
He was a lovely man, but he was a drunk.
So I'm pretty sure that Rodgers was the workhorse, and then Hart just rocked up and gave him a lyric in 5 minutes. But
which is what Sondheim criticises him for, of course, isn't it? For being a little bit
I think the
careless.
Criticism with his is that they're not. There are some great ones, but there are few and far between. You have to sort of sift through a lot.
He always says this thing, doesn't he? That you can open any book of lyrics by Lorenz Hart and find some sloppiness.
Yeah.
But then I did exactly the same thing with the first book of Sondheim lyrics, and found several examples of what I would consider to be lyrical sloppiness or idiosyncratic usage of the English to fit it into the rhythm. So
but I mean,
he uses wood too much, does our Sondheim.
Going back to Hammerstein, what you said about the fact that he's writing lyrics first, that's interesting what you said about Gilbert and Sullivan, because with Gilbert and Sullivan, to my ear at least, I'm sure you'll correct me about it. I'm sure you'll correct me about it, but it is, to me, it's essentially light verse. So it has a very regular meter, and it has dumpty dumpty dum dum. Whereas, and you can read it as light verse, and it's quite enjoyable to read. With Hammerstein, I don't know if you ever tried reading Hammerstein's lyrics. They're not good to read.
They're not poetry in their own right. No, that's a fair point. And Gilbert was a light versifier in the first instance,
So I think it would probably be easier for Gilbert to write it, whereas...
Of course, Gilbert was working 100 years earlier, or at least 70 years earlier.
Yeah.
I think people don't cut Gilbert or Sullivan enough slack for being the beginning of the business, and therefore finding the first steps from which the sophistication could step.
Yeah.
Yes, if people were writing Gilbert and Sullivan now, I would not consider it to be the highest form.
Yeah.
But I can't find anything better in the first, in the 100 years of the Victorian century.
No, I'm sure they're as you said before, the sort of granddaddies of it all, really.
Yeah.
But I think, but that does make Hammerstein quite interesting, and he's, and there are definitely things that are wrong with him. But I think he uses. He sometimes goes back into sort of operetta language. He sometimes does, as you mentioned, the word reversals.
The inverse. Yeah.
He has lots of bird imagery, and he's very sentimental, like the lark who's learning to pray. I mean, even that's a bit sugary for me.
There's also a lot of pseudo-religious stuff. I mean, not just in Carousel, where he goes up and meets the angels and looks down upon his kids and all this kind of. I find that a bit homespun and.
I think that's just what he's doing. I mean, I think that's just partly the style, really, his own thing. But I mean, the thing about, and the really interesting thing that I find that Sondheim picks up in it, and Sondheim, of course, knew Hammerstein as a father almost, and he makes all these criticisms of Hammerstein as a lyricist. And then in the end, he says, in the end, none of these things matter because he's monumental, and that's the word he uses. And I think that's really interesting. And I think what he means by that is that there's something in Hammerstein that he's so sort of earnest about his lyrics that he sort of pours himself into his lyrics, and you can sort of get a sense of that. He may not have been the smartest lyricist, or he may not have been the most precise or correct one, or funniest, or anything like that. But there is something about that. There is a sort of basic honesty there, which I think comes through, and I think is probably the reason why his shows are very popular.
Oscar Hammerstein, however, I think the thing that people don't realise about him, or never remember, is the fact that he's not just a lyricist, which is, as you say, the big thing he's remembered for, but the fact he is a big mover and shaker in the first 60 years, shall we say, of the 20th century, in terms of musical theatre. You know, he adored George M. Cohan, and he was not a much liked man at the point when he died, and paid for a statue to be erected to him. You know, he was working on Showboat, not just lyrically, but dramatically writing the stories as he did. I mean, he has a dark period, dry period.
That's right. Yeah.
But he's a great dramaturg in some ways. You know, you brought Oscar Hammerstein into sort of help fix shows and things like that. And even in, this takes us full circle, but in Love Never Dies. I don't know if you saw it, but they believed they were going to the house of Oscar Hammerstein to put on their show. This may have been the earlier Oscar Hammerstein, of course.
Oh, right.
But because I can't remember when
this
that's
would
set.
be his father, I think, who was the theatre owner. That's right. I think he gets a name check, doesn't he?
That's right. So yes, you're right. And Oscar Hammerstein does get mentioned in in a show as late as Love Never Dies.
Well, funny enough, I remember reading, because the Love Never Dies, I think it was in development for a long time. And at one point, Frederick Forsyth was actually going to be the book writer, I think.
That's how I remember it first being announced in the press.
And he ended up writing a novella called Phantom in Manhattan, presumably after he got kicked off it. Then he said, I'll use this in some way. And funnily enough, Irving Berlin turns up in the novella.
Does he?
Yeah, he turns up as there's some sort of swanky party being thrown, and he turns up as the pianist.
Early days. Well, it would have been, wouldn't it, of course?
So I think they must have done their dates and got their dates right, so it would have been
use Irving Berlin as a pianist.
Well, no, I think they got that wrong.
You might try Gershwin.
But yeah, I can see that the early drafts must have had all these sort of little references to the musicals at the time, which I was quite looking forward to seeing Irving Berlin on stage, but they'd obviously cut it by then.
Oh, how he hates to get up in the morning. So we've spoken about many of the greats, but we haven't spoken really much about Porter, and we haven't really spoken much about the Gershwins. Do you like Gershwin musicals?
Oh yes, yeah.
So what is it about it? You know, I think a Gershwin musical does sound different to any other of the great.
Well, I should say, when you say Gershwin musical, I probably like Gershwin songs.
Well, that's how they've survived. You're right. There's only one Gershwin musical that's ever revived, which is Lady Be Good. Yeah,
and I think generally with the shows around that period, that seems to be the case, that there's a lot of great songs but fewer great shows. But yeah, I do like Gershwin. Sometimes Ira Gershwin doesn't always interest me quite so much, or sometimes they're a little bit as if they're just sort of filler, the lyrics, and they don't feel. Yeah, sometimes I get that a little bit. I mean,
can you give an example?
But not for me. And the middle section there is when there are clouds of grey.
And then you rush and play, guarantee.
It's something like Winter's Day, and then Skies of Grey, and then Rush and Play, and you think Winter's Day, Skies of Grey. You know, it's not.
It's so passé.
It just doesn't quite. Sometimes that's just sort of filling in, and sometimes I think, and this is probably where we would disagree, because I know you're a rhyme man. I enjoy rhymes, but I don't think they're the sort of be all and end all. And sometimes I think the rhymes run away with themselves a little bit as a lyricist.
He's the one who looks like he's having most fun playing tricks.
That is true, and I think. But I wonder. I mean, reading about him as a man, he sounds fascinating.
And a lovely man, actually.
One of the most interesting sort of anecdotes I read about him was that he was an intensely shy person, and very much felt himself. Compared to his brother, he was very much the humble one, and you almost sort of get that. You almost sort of get that in the lyrics, that you sort of. He doesn't want to be too good, or doesn't want to outshine his brother in strange.
Well, you know, he used a pseudonym for the first few times he wrote, so he wasn't identified as George's brother.
That's right. It was the first big hit. Was it Swanee, or was it?
Swanee's
that was with a pseudonym, wasn't it? But no, I think. I mean, the fascinating story about him I find was apparently he was I don't know how old he was at the time, but he fell into a river once and was actually almost drowned. He couldn't swim. He fell into this river, and the way that he told the story afterwards, someone actually happened to be passing and jumped in and dragged him out. Fortunately. And afterwards, the guy who rescued him said, "Well, why you weren't shouting and screaming and waving your hands? Why weren't you doing that?" And apparently, the way he told it, he said he was just too embarrassed. And this kind of intense shyness, and don't want to put anyone out, sort of thing, even when you're drowning in a river. I think you make a fascinating man. But
well, you make a very interesting point about his slightly tricksy lyrics when he's putting his mind to it. Because, funny enough, obviously, you have established that I'm a great fan of Gilbert. He's not the only person I admire, but I do love Gilbert, and I love Gilbert is the first lyricist with craft. That's what I like about him, in my view. And even if you don't like his style of lyrics, I don't think you'll find anyone working better before him, and for some years afterwards as well, actually. And Ira Gershwin was the lyricist that I, speech marks, fell in love with in my teen period, when I was getting into the great Tim Pan-Alley catalogue and the interwar musicals. And he wrote a fantastic book of his own lyrics, years before Sondheim ever had the idea. Lyrics on several occasions.
That's right, it's a lovely
by
one,
Ira Gershwin Gent, is how it's described. And it is, and he gives a little bit of editorial on each song, which actually I wish Sondheim had done a bit more of, funny enough. Yeah. A bit more analysis.
No, that's a terrific book.
And it's one of my favourite books, and you can see all the... and he comes across as a nice man, and they're interesting anecdotes, and they're illuminating. But I think as an adult, I would say that Cole Porter is the heir to Gilbert, but actually as a teenager, I certainly thought Ira Gershwin was, and I still think there's a touch of Gilbert in both of them.
I remember you commenting on this on the blog, and
I just repeat myself over. I do.
No, but it was interesting because I think you were talking about the influence of Gilbert and Sullivan and whether we can sort of see the line. And I think for me...
Or draw it.
Sort of draw a line from Gilbert and Sullivan up to sort of Gershwin and Tim Van. But I think for me they are different. Partly not because Ira Gershwin wasn't influenced by... probably George Gershwin as well, actually, both influenced by Gilbert and Sullivan. But because the things that we best know Gershwin's for, I think, are different from the Gilbert and Sullivan stuff. So the things that the reason why I think we really like Gershwin is because of I Got Rhythm and because of Someone to Watch Over Me, and those sort of songs. And I think whilst in the musicals there are probably a lot of sort of patter stuff and comedy stuff which is very much directly linked to Gilbert and Sullivan. I think
the illegitimate daughter of the illegitimate son of the illegitimate nephew of Napoleon.
That's right. Whereas that's all you can see the link there. I think the things that the reason why we still talk about Gershwin is really those individual songs, and I think those are something different. Those are different from Gilbert and Sullivan. They're a different sort of thing.
But here's my question for you then: what is Ira Gershwin's masterpiece?
What as a song? Which song?
I mean, obviously, there's no categorical answer, but the one I would give you is possibly a little surprising.
The one I like the best is I'm going to forget the name.
One.
The Rockies will crumble, Gibraltar may tumble.
Our Love Is Here to Stay.
Our Love Is Here to Stay. Yeah.
Which is the one I think it's the one he wrote just after Gershwin, his brother died.
Oh, did he? I know it's a late one.
Yeah.
But,
I think it was just after the failed operation. So it was partly like we were talking about Candor and Ebb. It was a love letter to.
But that one and the way you wear a hat, the way you sip your tea, that sort of thing. Those sort of list songs, which they're not quite list songs, but.
But if you sped them up, that'd be a patter song. At one level.
Would it?
Well, no, it wouldn't. It's too cumbersome to sing fast, actually.
I'm glad I didn't agree with that.
But
I was almost going to
my answer to the best Ira Gershwin number is I Can't Get Started, which of course had music by Vincent Youmans and was for a revival of the Ziegfeld Follies in 1936. I've been around the world in a plane. Do you know I Can't Get Started?
I know the song, I'm just trying to remember it now. But,
I actually think that's Ira Gershwin's greatest lyric. But it's not with his brother. And that's what always strikes me about it. And actually Gershwin because he outlived his brother, then worked on with other people, and he was still turning out really good stuff. So he is not in his brother's shadow in any real sense.
No,
he may never have seen it.
Well, I mean, he's certainly a very loved composer. I mean, I think it was David Jacobs was a great fan of the radio presenter. Always going on about loved Gershwin. Ira Gershwin is a lyricist.
Do you know who? This is a bit of trivia. Do you know who Ira Gershwin's last personal assistant was? His last PA and secretary.
That was Michael Feinstein.
You do know? Yes, absolutely.
The singing archivist.
Yeah, jolly good he is too.
I think he was just sort of beginning his career as a sort of cabaret singer, wasn't he? And he happened to be in Hollywood, and I don't know quite how they managed to get together, but obviously Ira Gershwin had all his collections together and needed someone to put it all together. And
no one was going to do it with more fun than Michael Feinstein.
No. I actually saw him once. I've been to New York once in my life.
Oh, yeah.
And we actually went into Carnegie Hall. We weren't planning to, but we went to do a little tour of it, and it was so interesting to hear the acoustic. And we thought, we've got to see something. We've got to hear some music in here. And so we went to see a show which was a sort of a compilation show of all sorts of partly Broadway stuff, and there was sort of army singers singing there, sort of cadets and that sort of thing, a whole sort of mishmash of stuff. And then at the end, for some reason, Michael Feinstein turned up and did a couple of solo numbers just as a sort of surprise guest. I don't know if he does that a lot,
well, he might have done that. Yeah.
But yeah, he was very interesting. So.
I love Michael Feinstein because he turns up some really strange stuff as well. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen it, The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. It's the Dr. Seuss musical.
No.
If you're looking for an entertaining but not tremendously good musical on film, watch that. But there's a fantastic, the best villains number I've ever seen. There's the Dr. Terwilliger, after whom Sideshow Bob in The Simpsons is named.
Oh, okay.
Is the camp villain, played by Paul Heinrich, who went on to be the voice of Captain Hook in the Peter Pan for Disney.
Oh,
so he had a big history of songs and things, but he plays the villain, and he's about to take over the world with his 5,000 piano-playing children, or whatever it is. Don't ask. Anyway, so he sings this song called Dress Me, Dress Me, Dress Me. And Michael Feinstein covers it to absolute perfections. In fact, I would say that Michael Feinstein sounds like he's enjoying it just a touch too much. You know, there's a
Yeah, he is interesting. I mean, I've seen it. In fact, he did a show on Sky Arts recently. I don't know if you saw that, which was all about the Great American Songbook. Well, it was partly about that and partly about himself and how he's archived things. And he's literally just collected stuff. I mean, his whole house is just a mass of things which he's collected over the years, and these extraordinary collections where he goes around, antiques fairs and looking for old sheet music, and charity shops, and people donate things to him. Incredibly sort of strange and strange stuff and rare stuff. But I think he gets a reputation for when he's performing. He doesn't just sort of perform a song. He'll give you sort of a 10-minute introduction to the song and explain how he recovered the third verse, which had been lost for 20 years.
Yeah.
Sort of thing.
All praise to him, because if he doesn't, who's going to?
Yeah,
these things will get lost.
It is extraordinary, and the amount of things. I know another guy called John Wilson who's revived a lot of the orchestrations from Hollywood score, and he's had to recreate these orchestrations from the sort of great musicals and Broadway, well, mainly the film musicals. He's had to just listen to the original recordings and try and recreate them, reorchestrate them from scratch, and that's because when MGM sort of stopped doing their musicals, they just literally put them all in landfill. They just literally dumped them.
It's amazing, isn't it? And that was happening on Broadway as well, quite late. I mean, do you know The Good Companions, which is the last Johnny Mercer musical, done in Britain with an Andre Previn score, and orchestrations by Angela Morley, who was previously Wally Stott, who wrote the Hancock's Half Hour theme. She had a sex change and went to America. Now, Angela Morley only died about 2-3 years ago, and John Wilson was paid by the BBC to recreate The Good Companions. Mm-hmm. This great, and it's a fabulous musical. When it was on in London, it had Judi Dench in it, and John Mills. It's a fantastic cast. And the orchestrations had already been lost for that. This is a show that was on in London in 1974, and the orchestrations for a London show had disappeared, and he had to pull them out of nowhere again. And you just think, I mean, fantastic that he's doing it.
I mean, it does sort of point out that point up a lot of these things. It goes back to the sort of lowbrow, middlebrow type thing. A lot of it was just considered as popular entertainment, nothing
ephemeral.
more. It was ephemeral. It wasn't going to last 10 years. It wasn't going to last 5 years. And so why on earth keep them? But the fact that it is incredible that some of these songs are still being played.
Well, funny enough, it takes us back to Gilbert and Sullivan. I know it was a different period, but the fact there is a lost Gilbert and Sullivan is a crime against culture. I know not everyone likes Gilbert and Sullivan, but no one would deny Gilbert and Sullivan are important. And the fact there's one missing show, and you think, it is the dream that every day something might turn up. And I don't know if you know this, about 20 years ago, about 10 minutes worth of ballet music from the middle of it turned up. None of the songs, and you can't fit the lyrics from the other songs which still exist to the music, so you can't make anything of them. But the fact that pieces of music from 1869 will turn up. So we have to hope there's someone's got a box full of Gershwin numbers hidden in
someone's attic somewhere.
There's an attaché case with Ira's legatees, presumably somewhere have got that. But let's talk. The blog isn't your only intellectual output, is it? Because you are. Let's be honest. You are a musical theatre journalist. You are a contributor to a regular online magazine.
Well, I'm just. It's just something I've been starting doing recently. So branching out a little bit from the blog. So there's a relatively new online magazine and website started up called Musical Theatre Review, which is just musicaltheatreReview.com. And I've been doing a couple of features for those, just interviewing a couple of people. So that's being a little bit different and a little bit interesting. So hoping to continue with that.
And that is more interview, isn't it? Because, as I say, the blog is a series of essays about the things that tickle you or interest you or responses. But this is actually going out and meeting people face to face, not unlike this process.
Yes.
That is a different process. Is that something you're finding easy?
Yeah, well, as I say, it's only something I've just started doing, but it's something I'm certainly enjoying at the moment. It feels quite comfortable at the moment, I think, because as we were talking before about because you're a musical theatre fan, at some point in the interview, they'll realise, you are a musical theatre fan and you do know sort of what you're talking about, and so that sort of I think that sort of helps. And so certainly the interviews I've done so far have gone pretty well, and it's the magazine itself. I mean, it's quite a full magazine actually. They're coming out every couple of months, and it's a good sort of 100 pages or so. So
it's a chunky read.
It's a chunky read. There's lots of news, lots of reviews, lots of features, and this sort of thing. But I think it's all quite positive stuff as well. I mean, it's all meant to support musical theatre and be positive about musical theatre and this sort of thing.
We're all in it for that. Where would any of us be without musical theatre?
Yeah. So hopefully I'll be able to do a little bit more for that. That'd be great.
So we've had a wide-ranging conversation, and you if you don't mind me saying, you revealed your hand as someone who does love musical theatre and has a sound knowledge of it. But in terms of your blog and the things that you put on Middlebrow musicals, just off the top of your head, then what articles are you most happy with, or you're most delighted to publish, or you've had most comments on? Because let me tell you, you wrote one about what makes a concept musical a concept musical, and we had a very interesting debate back and forth on the blog, which I really enjoyed, about the difference between gimmicks and concepts and all that kind of stuff. But I know, and you recently put something up about. You actually said, I think more than once, but Chicago is the only cool musical, which I can't tell you I have bought into, but there we are. So, but you must get responses. What are you proud of? What have you had responses on?
Well, different things. I mean, some of the ones that get the most sort of hits, so presumably the most read, although I'm never quite sure how the statistics on
There's one thing out the other, yes, fine.
But some of those are actually the ones, not sometimes where you're sort of venturing out of musical theatre a little bit. So there was one I did earlier in this year, I think, where I talked about Calvin Harris, who's actually a DJ, a dance, who does dance music and has a lot of hits. And I know nothing about dance music really, but he actually won the Ivor Novello Award, I think it was this year, for the best song. And there was an article then online about, should this guy have won this song, because the Ivor Novello Award, because when you broke down what he was actually doing, he's really a producer rather than so much a songwriter. And if you actually looked at the song as a song, it was basically 4 chords and about 5 words. It's just a repeated chorus. It was, it's a very good hit single, but
popularity does not mean craft.
But as a song, should it really be recognised? So I was just commenting on that, and for some reason that sort of got quite a few hits. And another one was, I don't know if you know, there's a singer-songwriter called Neil Hannon, who's best known as the Divine Comedy, and he wrote a musical about a year back now called Swallows and Amazons, which played at the Chichester Festival Theatre. I went to see that and wrote some response to that, and that got quite a high hit. So I think maybe picking up people outside of just the musical people, and sort of fans of other types of music and things as well, sort of picking up on it. But in terms of the things that I'm most proud of having written, I think probably the reviews, they're probably the things that take the most work. They tend to be a bit longer, the reviews, than most of the posts.
Longer to read and longer to think.
And longer to write about. And I do try and, as I said, they're not reviews of current stuff, they're reviews of older stuff, but I do try and sort of, say something new about them, something that at least I haven't read about them before, and just try and think a bit more deeply about them, about why they work, if they work, and how they've been constructed.
Well, Cameron, I hope this isn't going to be the last time we speak to each other face to face, although I've had great pleasure over the last few years speaking to you via your blog.
Yes.
And I do hope that anyone listening to Musical Talk will also go to Middlebrow Musicals, just because it's the best musical theatre blog out there. There's no doubt about that.
Well, that's very kind. It's a niche market, but it's good.
There's room for us all. But forgive me, you always give food for thought, and it's a very nourishing casserole that you're serving up. If I know.
That's very kind.
So remind us again. Do you know the website?
Yes, it's Middlebrow Musicals, all one word, .blogspot.co.uk. I think. But if you just Google Middlebrow Musicals,
that's how I
you will probably find it.
And the magazine?
And the magazine is musicaltheatrereview.com, and as I say, there's a lot of content on the website, and then there's also a magazine to go with it, which is a subscription one, but I think you can still get an issue for free, and it's pretty substantial, and there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
Cameron, all power to your elbow, and I look forward to enjoying, appreciating, occasionally sparring, but talking to you again in the world of musical theatre.
Thank you very much, thanks.
Well, my thanks to Cameron for allowing me to catch up with him in London and talk to him. As I said last week, you can read a lot of his work on www.musicaltheatrereview.com, which is a wonderful website in its own right, and you can read his considered essays at his own blog, middlebrowmusicals.blogspot.co.uk. So make sure you pop along to both of those and have a good delve. Have a rummage, why not? And if you pour yourself a drink at the same time, it could be a gin rummage, which is a very poor gag, which ironically shows that I'm not a card. I'm going to stop now, and the best way to do that, of course, is with the magic word. Here it is. Goodbye! This episode of Musical Talk edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2016. And don't forget you can find Musical Talk in all the usual places, including Facebook and Twitter. And if you want to see me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.